welcome to today's webinar on planning for solar, navigating planning process to ensure successful development of solar projects. So my name is Francesca Kalani and I am one of our policy analysts here at the REA, also known as the Association for Renewable Energy and Clean Technology. So I work in power and flexibility and green finance, looking after our solar and energy storage forum and our green finance forum. So today's webinar, as we all know, planning has long been a significant barrier to the deployment of renewable energy, particularly in solar development. And I think whilst we're starting to see some positive changes, such as recent moves by government to streamline planning processes and ongoing consultations, such as proposed reforms to the National Planning Policy Framework, NPPF, challenges still remain. So today we'll focus on how to unlock the delivery of future solar projects, how to overcome planning barriers, and how to fully realise community benefits of solar projects. So today we're fortunate to have 4 expert speakers from a wide range of backgrounds who will provide their insights on these topics. Each will have about 10 minutes to share their views, after which we'll open the floor to discussion and audience Q&A. So please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A part at the bottom of your screen throughout, so that it's not all at the end. And without further ado, I think we can begin. So our first speaker is Joanna Beach. So over to you, Joanna.
Right, hello, I hope it's all working. Just a bit of background about me. So I am developer side. I am working as a lead DCO planner at Akira, so I'm very much sitting with that developer hat today, but I have prior experience of working on the planning and environment consultancy side with solar development. I've worked on 2 DCOs before. I kind of wanted to put this in terms of who the key players are and how we all interact. One of the things that we find on the development side is grid is one of the key issues that we have in terms of site planning. I spend a lot of my time looking at the site selection process and how we determine which land we take, and there's kind of this chicken and egg scenario which we're seeing at the moment, where lots of the connections are now all at new substations, which National Grid have not decided where they're going yet, and in some instances they haven't even started their work in terms of choosing particular options for those. There are different tactics that are kind of being seen, and we're discussing at the moment with how you approach that. And in terms of trying to force National Grid's hand, it's quite hard to get to the table unless you're quite advanced with your land. But then you don't want to be very advanced with your land if your point of connection could be quite far away from actually where you start. So there's this whole issue of how do you make that work, because you need to justify your land taken. Grid is this kind of that point of connection is your starting point where you make that decision. So that's kind of one of the really big challenges. And I think this all kind of comes into the fact that there isn't this coordinated networks approach. I think a lot of people, everyone wants a spatial plan in all types of planning, but this coordination of electricity networks and energy networks is something that I'm seeing a lot, and I know others are in the industry. I've got sites where you've got new lines proposed as part of National Grid's great upgrade, and new substations very close, and there's this lack of kind of coordination in terms of, well, why aren't we joining this all up, and how does it all work together? Energy doesn't work in an isolated development like other forms like Resi, etc. on one site. It's so interconnected with the network that each part feeds another part. So I think it's definitely a big call for some kind of wider planning on networks. And with that, we see a lot of issues on the cumulative. So the cumulative and collaboration, I think, is growing. It's becoming more and more of an issue at hearings. I'm seeing it come up a lot. And we're seeing it in terms of not just cumulative in terms of another solar developer, but you've also got, again, all the National Grid network planning, all different types of infrastructure all happening at once. And everybody, obviously, with the change in kind of the national level of policy is probably jumping to try and get their schemes through quite quickly. There's obviously a lot of favour now at the DCO level. We've seen a lot of decisions happen favourably very quickly. And I think what we're seeing is the Lincolnshire example is probably the first one, but it's not the last, where you've got shared grid connection, shared cable routes, where you're having to deal with sharing land, sharing cable routes in terms of trying to minimize your impacts is a really key thing. And where we can engage with another developer to do that, that should be happening. It's difficult because of the commercial side that happens. So there's a lot of kind of smoke and dagger because you don't want to let on too much commercially, but if you're very early on in the process, but you need to have some kind of coordination in terms of if you can use the same land, if you can construct that cable route at the same time, you're digging once rather than twice. The construction traffic associated with that is also a lot less. So that's one of the things that we're looking at on our sites, but I know it's happening across, and the Lincolnshire schemes, the 4 of them that have done it, it was a challenge, having been on one side of it, and I know loads of people have been involved in trying to do that. I think some kind of on the technical side, the time frame in decommissioning, something that's coming more and more. There's a lot of discussion about what happens after 40 years, or now what happens after 60 years, because the time frames are moving as technology improves. And then is the site going back to what it was? Will you repower? These are all the unknowns that I don't think have quite been worked out. And I don't think other schemes that have been built are quite far along enough to necessarily have got to that stage either. And I think particularly on that time frame one, we often rely on the fact that impacts are reversible. But at what point does the length get so long that you lose that weight of that argument? 60 years of someone living next to a solar farm is a very long time. And depending on how old they are, that could be the rest of their lifetime. So for them, they don't see it as temporary or reversible. And I think, yeah, as I say, that's going to be an interesting one to see. We have a lot of comments come through about the solar panels will not last for 60 years. So you're going to need to replace technology. And as you replace it, are you going to replace it all at once because it all got installed at once? And how that process of upgrading the panels or changing them as they tire, or you need to make amendments and improvements, that's something that, again, it could trigger a whole other construction phase if you were doing a lot of them at once. And having that planning of how you're going to do that as an operator is something that, again, is being questioned quite a lot. And I think the other thing just to bring is this, we're in a rapidly advancing technology. So where we started with solar, it's grown very quickly up to the DCO level. And I think lots of things haven't caught up yet. And I think trying to communicate that to communities is, I mean, it's hard. We've had a first DCO scheme go in that was a DC coupled. So you've got the DC, the AC, you've got whether you're the different types of inverters. It gets very complicated with all of the different technology going in and how it works. Trying to even communicate that to your everyday person is very tricky. And I think that's a very big challenge. And us trying to deal with how we assess it, again, is challenging. Because different technology, different inverters have different noise levels, etc. It becomes very, if you want, obviously as a developer, we want as much flexibility as we can. But with that, you need to ensure that you're capturing all the various different scenarios for impacts. So yeah, I think in terms of the consultation for communities, I think that is one of the hardest things to try and get them to understand what is a solar scheme, what does it look like, what does it mean? I think they're more familiar with what a wind turbine looks like compared to solar. So kind of just in terms of drawing on that community side, we're very early on, but in terms of there's a lot of talk about benefits. And I think that we need to be careful in terms of whether we're talking about financial benefits or other types of benefits. I think the community benefits phrase gets used a lot. Lots of awareness is about the community benefit fund. I think people understand it in terms of money. I don't think there's as much understanding perhaps in terms of the softer side of it, the socioeconomic value. or the sort of more tangible benefits, and what could you do? Could you actually build something on your scheme? Could you build, we've got permissive pathways, you can do all sorts of kind of nature leisure things associated with that. But perhaps I think the way we report it in our environmental reports and our planning statements, etc., doesn't necessarily bring out what it really means, or how does this improve the value of this area. And one of the things that I know others will come on to in terms of making communities feel invested, there's a lot of thought in terms of the shared ownership approach, or different models like Ripple and Octopus are currently showing different things. But the Octopus one with their fan club, they are unique in the sense that they are the operator and also a consumer provider of energy. I think on the large scale, it's a very difficult model to replicate at scale. Be very interested to hear ideas in terms of how that happens. We have kind of a very complicated set up with the CFD, or planning the power purchase agreements in terms of where your power goes. And again, that adds to that complexity of actually how do we show community benefit or ownership? How do they feel like they own or value some of it? And I guess the other thing that we're dealing with more positively at the national level, with the DCO levels sort of decision making, but the politics in local decision making is still a big issue. I think from our perspective, the threshold change to the 150 level probably won't necessarily make much difference. You'll be going to an appeal if you did a scheme like that in most instances. I don't think changing the policy makes a difference. I think what really needs to happen is how it's implemented. There's no recourse for those committees where they completely go against their planning officer's advice, or any other specialist advice for that matter. We've had a few instances where you've got poor planning officer who is grappling, trying to find some kind of justification just to warrant the refusal that their committee members have decided, just because they don't like solar, rather than any other sort of more concrete planning reason. And I think for me personally, this comes down to this knowledge and skills gap that is across the industry, but particularly in planning. I know there's a massive shortage of planners, full stop, but it's this knowledge and skills gap when it comes to infrastructure and renewable energy planners. Personally, when I did my studies, my planning masters was focused very much on resi and an urban area. There wasn't very much covered in terms of the practicalities of how the DCO approach works, or in terms of sort of infrastructure and the environmental side of it. And I think that's something that if we're going to bridge the gap to get to our net zero and building all of these renewable energy generating places, that we need people with the right skills and the right knowledge on both the putting it in on the development side, but also in terms of the decision making side. Most local authorities, lots of planning officers don't come across an environmental impact statement very often. So for them to come across a nationally significant project and have to deal with the examination and representations and all of the stuff that goes with it, I think is very difficult for them to grapple with, let alone then be meaningful in their engagement with it.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Joanna. That's been great. I mean, I think that definitely aligns with some of the stuff that we've noticed at the REA. So as you said, it's not just about regulations, but also ensuring that planning departments sort of properly resourced to handle the volume and complexity of applications as well. So I think that's definitely an area that's often overlooked. So thank you for that. I'm sure we'll get some questions that will come in to expand on that a bit more. So we're now going to go over to our second speaker. So Colin. So Colin, if I can invite you to start. So Colin Turnbull, Director at DWD.
Hello, everybody. Thanks very much. So I'm a director at DWD, and we've got a large team of planning consultants advising on solar projects at all scales. So we're taking quite a few through the appeal process at the moment and through the development consent order process as well. I'm afraid I don't have any slides, but I'm just going to talk about some of the practical issues that face planning and DC applications for solar projects in our sort of recent experience. In summary, these are to do with the National Planning Policy Framework, or the NPPF, and archaeological evaluation, and also how we co-locate batteries with solar projects. So I'll cover the National Planning Policy Framework first. So, for all scales of renewable energy, we need strong support in the NPPF because it is the sort of backbone of planning policy. And this is going to be particularly important as well if we have a change to the NSIP thresholds. I think other speakers are going to talk about that a bit more, but it's part of the current government consultation. And if that increases to 150 megawatts, for example, then you're going to see a lot more solar projects go through the local planning process where the NPPF is the main national policy context. So in essence, the current NPPF doesn't explicitly recognise the urgency of renewable energy infrastructure, which is quite a surprising omission. Sort of, we're halfway through 2024, and it doesn't talk about urgency. And even in the consultation draft NPPF that's been published recently, with a deadline of the 24th of September, there still isn't mention of urgency. And I find that quite strange because the incoming government have talked about bringing forward the ambition for a net zero electricity system from 2035 to 2030. That's only 6 years away, and clearly, solar has a massive part to play in, delivering that scale of renewable energy in that, sort of under 6 year time scale. So you'd expect the NPPF to maybe use the word urgency, because that's certainly the wording that's used in the national policy statements. So that's a bit strange. Just to go into a bit more detail, the draft NPPF hasn't actually changed any of the text about renewable energy projects in the Greenbelt. So there have been quite a lot of changes in the NPPF about Greenbelt in relation to housing, and they've introduced the term grey belt for the less high quality existing Greenbelt, for example. But it's a bit strange that they haven't chosen to do any updates to the way that renewable energy projects and the Greenbelt are treated in policy. So I think there should be some strengthening of the text there around the weight to be given to decarbonisation. And they could make a link with grey belt because they've made it for housing, so why not renewable energy? And there's still some ambiguity at paragraph 164. That's the former paragraph 163. So that's the main text about renewable and low carbon development. In essence, I think it's still a bit too ambiguous about what renewable and low carbon development is, and it certainly doesn't specify energy storage, which we find leads to some misunderstandings. There's some local authorities. And I think the main bit I wanted to touch on of interest to developers is at paragraphs 161 and 165 in the draft NPPF. There's been a very subtle text change at 161, and this now requires local authorities to identify areas for renewable energy development. Now, this is probably aimed at wind mainly, but it will catch solar, as it's currently worded. And then there's a paragraph relating to this, 165, and that says that, applicants for developments outside of the identified locations need to demonstrate conformity with the site selection criteria that the local authority used when they were planning locations. Again, it's probably focused on wind because wind has these wider visual impacts across large areas because of the height of them and so on. But solar just doesn't have that. So in my view, 161 and 165 are quite problematic, I would say, for solar developers, because it's sort of leading solar through this path of having to identify sites, even though they don't really have wider visual impacts. They're very small scale compared to onshore wind. So I think that those policies should be made specific to wind, frankly. So that's some of my views about the NPPF, and I think obviously we'll have a discussion on it, but the industry needs to respond to this consultation, and as I say, the deadline's the 24th of this month. And on a side note, just remember, when you're making representations on local plans, do ensure they reflect the urgency and critical national priority policies in the NPSs, because it is actually a requirement for soundness that local plans comply with not only the NPPF, but other statements of national policy.
Thank you, Colin. Yeah, so as Colin said, the deadline for the consultation is, I think is it the 24th of September? Something along those lines.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think as you said, we'll talk a bit more about that probably, and we can maybe, if we have time, we can tell people how they can feed into that consultation at the end. So thank you for that, Colin. We'll now head over to Richard Marsh, partner at BDB Pitmans.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Richard Marsh. I'm a partner at BDB Pitmans. I lead the energy team, and my main focus is on promoting large-scale energy projects, including solar. As a team, we promote all sorts of major infrastructure projects, energy and transport. So today I'm going to focus on a couple of DCO NSIP related points. So I'll zip through as quick as I can in the next 10 minutes. The first one is in relation to recent NSIP reform, which has been wide-ranging and has taken place over the last couple of years. So just a quick run through the summary of those reforms. Fast-track consenting, which is where I'm going to focus on the next slide, is about speeding up the DCO process for certain types of projects. There's also various measures to allow for cost recovery by statutory bodies and other stakeholders involved in the NSIP process, including full cost recovery by PINs, and again I'll come on to that. Strengthening performance by government bodies such as Natural England and Environment Agency to engage in the process, improving the engagement by local authorities and communities, and then also sort of more the soft side, building skills needed to support infrastructure delivery. There are also a range of measures that some of which are yet to come into being, including the quite major step of replacing the current process of EIA with environmental outcome reports, and making the NSIP process more digital than it currently is. Next slide, please. So I mentioned I was going to focus on the NSIP fast track. Now, this is a proposal to reduce the time frame for the consideration of DCO applications to allow a 12-month target timescale. At present, that timescale is on average 18 months. So the plan is for a shorter examination period. At the moment, that's a maximum of 6 months. So to bring that down to 4, and then also at the back end, reducing the examiner's report time frame from 3 months to 2.5 months, and Secretary of State decision time also to 2.5 months. Now, these fast-track projects will be delivered via certain measures. One of the key ones, one of the headline points, is that it will involve paying the planning inspectorate a annual fee of at present circa £209,000 a year to undertake various pre-application tasks. In order to gain entry to this fast track process for certain projects, the project will need to fulfil a quality standard, again, which I'll come on to next slide. And also, sorry, could you just go back? Just got to finish off that slide. And the decision has to be made by PINs for that project to be selected for the fast track. Now, an in-principle decision is made at acceptance, but again, that's not guaranteed, and that can be reversed if it becomes apparent that issues can't be dealt with in that reduced 4-month period examination. So it could be the case that you've paid all this money for the enhanced service at pre-application, and then either the application for fast track is turned down at acceptance or potentially reversed before examination. So potentially wasted time and costs, not only those direct costs to PINS, but also obviously the costs of your consultants to produce the various documents that are required for the fast track service. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the fast track quality standard, which needs to be met in order to be considered. The primary one there is the principal areas of disagreement test, which states that areas of disagreement between the parties have been clearly articulated by the applicant, and that they're limited in number and scope. So essentially you need to demonstrate that all the issues can be dealt with in that reduced 4-month period of examination. Secondly, that you've undertaken, or the applicant has undertaken, all the relevant steps, and that those are steps that are set out in the program management document, which is a document that you need to produce and submit at the inception of your project. So roughly the same time when you have your PINS inception meeting. Also that you've used the premium enhanced pre-application service, which is the £208,000 a year. Now there are three levels of service which PINS have introduced, which are set out in their prospectus, which was published a couple of months ago. There's basic, standard, and enhanced. Basic is, as it suggests, quite basic. The standard service is pretty similar to the current service, so also involves or allows PINS to do things like have meetings with the applicant and review application documents before the application is submitted. And then the enhanced service is what we're talking about now. It's a much greater level of engagement by PINS in relation to producing various other documents, including the program management document and documents such as the principal areas of disagreement. In terms of advice, so advice produced by PINS under section 51, that needs to be taken heed of. So that's another strand of the test. That you've complied with all the enhanced pre-application procedures, that there's clarity on your documentation, and essentially that you've demonstrated that the matters for examination can be dealt with in the shortened 4-month period. Next slide, please. So as I say, the fast track process is not guaranteed. You can spend all the money on that service and either be turned down at the point of acceptance or even at a stage beyond that and prior to examination, which obviously incurs costs, the PINS costs and your consultant costs. So I think obviously this is all pretty fresh. Projects that haven't completed scoping by April 24 will need to pay this service if they want to do the fast track from 1st of October this year. If projects have submitted their scoping or stated they'll be submitting an environmental statement before April 24, then this cost would be triggered from April 2025. So this is all very fresh. I'm reserving judgment on how successful it will be. Hopefully it will be successful. But this slide is really to demonstrate that even without the fast track, things can be done, measures can be taken by the applicants and by the consultant team to speed up the process, both in pre-application, but also potentially at examination. So at the moment, the examination is a maximum of 6 months, but there's no reason why that couldn't be a shorter period, even without the fast track process. And there are various measures that could be taken, and that could be to save time by not actually submitting a scoping report and requesting a scoping opinion. A lot of the scoping opinions coming out of PINS recently are relatively similar, and I think quite predictable in terms of the areas of environmental assessment that need to be considered. So query whether you can actually dispense with that step to save time and also consultant costs. Potentially limiting non-statutory consultation activities to save time and money. Obviously, that depends on the relevant community. So maybe in Lincolnshire, it would be sensible to have an enhanced non-statutory consultation to allay any local fears. Pre-application services, as I mentioned, even with the standard service, so a service that costs a mere £126,000 a year, PINS offers that document review service before submission. Again, a step to reduce acceptance risk. Also, in terms of consultation, I think it's sensible to wait until your scheme is sufficiently designed and developed to undertake a meaningful statutory consultation, particularly if you are only doing a single statutory consultation and dispensing with a full non-stat. To produce, you said we did documents, which are very popular these days, again to reduce the need for reconsultation and really demonstrate how you've taken account of consultation feedback. And then also, I mean, this is a pretty obvious, but engaging early with the LPA, with various statutory bodies such as Natural England Environment Agency, and undertaking any engagement with bodies that require either agreements or protected provisions within the DCO or statements of common ground. And as I said earlier, there's no reason why you can't push for a shorter examination if it can be demonstrated that all the issues can be dealt with before the 6 months is up. And then also the final point, which again is pretty obvious, appoint a consultant team who's gone through the DCO process several times before. Next slide, please. And then just very quickly, because I'm slightly over time. So in terms of the NSIP solar threshold consultation, which is part of the NPPF consultation, which Colin mentioned, that closes on the 24th of September. So get your responses in. The link is down there. In relation to solar, as has been mentioned, there's a proposal to increase that NSIP threshold from 50 megawatts to 150. I mean, there's no reason why a different threshold could be arrived at, or even that threshold won't change at all. So there's clearly a dearth of solar projects between 49.9 megawatts and circa 150 that just haven't come forward. But as I say, there are several instances of projects of 49.9 megawatts appearing adjacent to each other, which is fine as long as they're sort of corporately structured the right way and the grid connection is separate. So that is possible, and there are legal routes around that threshold issue. But also, as Joanne alluded to, there are several benefits of going the DCO route, including that sort of local political uncertainty. You may have an LPA that's completely opposed to what is a large-scale, nationally significant infrastructure project that's 150 megawatts, and a nervousness around consenting that when there may be significant local opposition. Whereas obviously the DCO process involves a decision by the government and examination by an independent examiners. In terms of timescale, yes, the DCO process can be longer and more involved and expensive from a consultant and other third-party costs perspective, but it does give that degree of certainty in terms of timescale, and hopefully that will be further reinforced by the fast track if that proves to be successful. There's also no ability with a TCPA planning application to acquire land and rights, whereas under a DCA you can include, or at least seek to include, compulsory acquisition rights within the application. And also, I mean, Colin alluded to planning policy. Obviously, the PPF is the relevant national policy, but there could also be local planning policy, which isn't particularly supportive of solar developments of this large scale. And then the final point to note is that it should be, if this does happen, then it should be possible for promoters to, if they think that some of these points here are relevant, that they can elect to go the DCO route via a Section 35 direction. I won't go into the precise details of Section 35 direction because I'm well over time, but do feel free to get in touch if you want to discuss that.
Thank you, Richard. So we're now moving on to our final speaker, so Rebecca Windermere, Planning and Communities Lead at Regen.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Windermere. I head up our work on planning and communities at Regen. For those who haven't heard of Regen before, we're an independent, not-for-profit centre of energy expertise. A lot of our work in the planning and community space includes research, thought leadership projects, and policy work. We're also a membership organisation, and I head up our members' working group on planning. Next slide, please. So in my section of this presentation, I'm going to focus on the community side of things, because if we're to see the scale of increase in solar and other renewables that we want to achieve, getting the community on board is going to be a key part of that. We've already seen from the new government a kind of recognition of the importance of communities, of wider public acceptance, of community energy, and of kind of helping to get the messaging right around renewables. And on the screen now, I've just got a few recent headlines just to kind of emphasize the scale of the challenge we're seeing at the moment, particularly with those larger scale solar farm developments. But I think it's also particularly important to highlight here that opposition groups and those against solar can be very, very vocal, and these kind of headlines we're seeing are not reflective of the wider public opinion around solar. So it's important to think about how can we make sure we're reducing opposition, but also making sure the voices of those who support solar or are kind of on the fence about it are being heard. Next slide, please. So I've noted down some areas that I see as key areas of challenge, but also potential opportunity. So firstly, the size of projects. As we just heard from Richard, there's what we're seeing is a lot of either kind of projects up to 49.9 megawatts, or we're then seeing the kind of very, very large projects. And those large projects are often getting quite a lot of opposition. And there is a potential opportunity now with the moving of the thresholds that we may see more of those kind of mid-scale projects come forward. And that could be beneficial because, yeah, as I mentioned, those extremely large projects can get more opposition. Secondly, impacts on locally valued land uses. And this is where engagement is really key. So in the planning process, we're thinking about kind of the nationally designated land uses, protected landscapes, those aspects. But actually, when it comes down to the individual applications, it's often the case of understanding why local people may value particular areas. So that could be something like in a particular field, people really like a particular walking route. So if you're engaging early with the community and understanding before you've kind of designed the project that there's one particular area of land they really want to protect, then that can reduce a lot of opposition going forward. First, the spread of misinformation. This is something we've heard a lot about recently, particularly when engaging with the cross-parliamentary group on renewables. They highlighted that there was a spread of misinformation, both from MPs as well as in the public more generally. And actually, it's worth flagging that at Regen at the moment, we're creating a myth-busting guide to try and kind of reduce this spread of misinformation and set out the facts. And For solar, one of the kind of biggest ones we've been seeing is around the myth that once a solar farm has been in place, the land will then turn into brownfield land, which obviously everyone on this call knows isn't true. But that kind of myth has really been spreading, and it's been being spread by kind of opposition groups, and then that kind of increases the level of opposition we're seeing to projects. So really making sure that the correct information is out there is really important. And also opinions of local benefits. I think this was touched upon earlier, but just making sure we're actually communicating the benefits of solar. Firstly, kind of on the large scale in terms of the contribution to renewables, but also the range of benefits we're seeing from projects, both in terms of kind of biodiversity, community benefit funds, all the different aspects we're seeing. Next. So to follow on from this, it's really important that we're getting engagement right. And a key part of that is engaging as early as possible. As I mentioned on the last slide, with the kind of example around locally valued landscapes, if you're getting in and speaking to a community really early in the process, you can address some of those issues before they kind of really get raised. So it's a real case of kind of understanding what the community wants and what's important to them. Linked to that is reaching the whole community. So often with kind of community consultation, there may be an event in the village hall where you'll get the certain groups, you kind of know who's going to turn up. But actually, when kind of more efforts are put into good engagement with things such as kind of opportunities to comment online, doing events that are more kind of targeted to the wider community, such as turning up to existing community events, considering the local demographics, do materials need to be provided in a different language, those different aspects that try and reach the wider community rather than the usual suspects. Doing that is kind of a really good way to kind of give that opportunity for more people to share their voice, and hopefully more of those people that are on the fence or supportive to contribute. Also, I've put understanding the local perspective, and what I really mean here is focusing on local needs and understanding that all communities are different and are going to have different kind of preferences and needs and different ways that they like to be engaged with and involved. And finally, ongoing engagement. So not just doing engagement when it's required as part of the planning process, but engaging both early and also subsequent to the planning process. And this links to what was mentioned earlier in terms of thinking about repowering and that ongoing relationship with the community. And for that, having a kind of a named point of contact that local people can speak to is really valuable. Next slide, please. And in terms of community benefits, obviously we haven't seen community benefits for all solar farms, but it is becoming increasingly common to have community benefits. And as well as really highlighting the benefits that we're seeing from existing projects, it's important to think about how benefits for new projects can be tailored to the particular communities. So like with the engagement, recognizing that there's no kind of one size fits all, that all communities are unique. So some communities may value a traditional community benefit fund, where there's a pot of money to spend on local projects. Others may want to prioritize support for local environmental projects. They may be looking for kind of in-kind support to help with local community energy projects. They may be more focused on kind of biodiversity needs, improved walking routes. And again, that's where that kind of widespread engagement, getting the opinions of the wider community can be really valuable. And we've seen some kind of really good examples of projects coming forward with community benefits that actually kind of really respond to local needs. Next slide, please. And finally, I wanted to touch upon shared ownership, which I think is a really exciting opportunity for developing solar farms, particularly if we want to really kind of increase the number we're having in a way that's benefiting communities directly. So shared ownership enables the community to directly own part of the solar farm. They're then directly benefiting it from it financially, but they're also getting that sense of ownership. So they're likely to support it more because they know that money and profits are coming to the local area, local people are partly owning it, and it overcomes that opposition about where profits are going. So we're starting to see shared ownership for solar farms now. One example I wanted to touch upon is Forest Gate Solar Farm in Wiltshire, which was granted planning permission last year, and they have a 20% community ownership stake. That project's led by Eden Renewables, and we're aware that Eden Renewables had really early conversations with the local climate group, Net Zero Chippenham, to really understand what local people would want from a solar farm development. And then that led to discussions around community ownership. And we're aware that with the new government, GB Energy, shared ownership may be something that's being looked at more. At Regen, we're doing a paper at the moment looking at the potential for shared ownership and the potential kind of opportunities with GB Energy. So I think that's kind of an exciting opportunity to be aware of. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Rebecca. So just going to the Q&A quickly. So the first question is, the vast majority of people do support solar and don't mind if it's in their area. How do we better harness that support? So I think, as we've all said on the call, I think we're fully aware that there is support out there, particularly when you compare it to other forms of renewable energy. I think it's really important that we do acknowledge this and that we are, it's not maybe as complicated or as difficult for us compared to some other technologies. So I think it's 88% of those asked support overall. So maybe this question is probably best suited to Rebecca and Joanna. So I know, Rebecca, that you quickly touched on sort of shared benefits, and then Joanna, you talked about community benefit funds. So are there anything in particular that you've seen, any examples of how people can harness this support, or anything that your favorite way that regions have done this?
I think when we're talking about kind of demonstrating support, it's really important to kind of get the wider community engaged in the project, because normally what you see when you look at responses to planning applications, really for any form of renewables, is you see those people that are opposed submitting objections. So I think really it's a case of making it as easy as possible for people to show their support. And I think that really starts with wider engagement using different methods. If people can just kind of go on their phone, look at the solar farm application and say kind of, yes, I'm happy with this. Yeah, so making it as easy as possible for people, I think.
And Joanna, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an element of, in some areas, certain individuals are worried about what their neighbours say and think. There's definitely, we have it on a landowner perspective. You know, our landowners are worried about what happens when they, you know, it goes public that their land is in this scheme. You know, what's the backlash that's going to happen? And there's definitely this feeling that those that shout the loudest are often the most negative, but it isn't always a reflection of the wider area of community. I think it's coming, that early bit of coming back to say, not here's my red line, what do you think? But if we put a solar farm here, what would you like to see from it? And it's that also about communities understanding what they can ask for, right? can they ask the developer that we need some investment in this local school, can you help us with this? Or we've got this project we want to do, we can't get it off the ground because we don't have the skills and knowledge to organize it, but could you do this? Could you support this as part of your project? And I think they don't know that they can ask for that. And because we've got this wall of no solar in my area, or that kind of that initial anti-solar feeling, that it makes that harder. So there's that element of trying to give communities the knowledge of what they can and can't ask for, and then they can come forward. It's definitely something we're looking at. On one of our projects, through our condition, we have what's called a community liaison group, and that's kind of working through the discharge of conditions. And we're finding that that's quite, whilst it's been difficult with the local politics, it's also been very helpful for them, and they feel heard, they feel listened to, because yes, a lot of it is a case of explaining the process to them, but it's a process that they don't understand where they can influence or can't, or what's happening. So at least it's been a way of informing them what's going on.
Yeah, thank you both. So now we're going to have a look at some of the issues which can arise in co-locating battery energy storage systems with solar projects. So maybe we'll go to Colin first, then we'll go over to Richard.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about batteries a bit, as they're increasingly co-located with solar projects. On DCOs, you can include a battery as associated development, but you do have to justify why it's associated development. And when you're doing that, you can't pay too much reference to the very old government guidance on associated development. So you have to sort of make it out in sort of technical terms. And the new EN3, the NPS EN3, even tells developers they should include layouts that include storage and don't include storage. That's paragraph 21071. So it's sort of definitely moving up the agenda, but it's still down to the applicant to kind of make out why they're including it in the DCO application. And some of the solar projects that were had their DCOs made in July included batteries, but it's worth developers looking at how they made that case out. And then on local planning applications, you've got the National Planning Practice Guidance that tells you how to plan for batteries, and that in turn links to the National Fire Chiefs Council's own guidance to fire personnel. But interestingly, the NFCC have published a draft update to that's more planning oriented. So it's stated that it's for both fire personnel and planning officers to use. So the consultation on that ended in late August. But I think the key points about co-locating solar and battery there are that the NFCC guidance doesn't explicitly talk about co-located projects. So it talks a lot about distances from the edge of the site and distances from the edge of the number of accesses, for example, to the site. But it's important for developers to work with local fire and rescue services, because what they probably mean by that is the entrance to the battery compound itself rather than the overall solar site. And there is a requirement now for a 30-meter setback from batteries to adjoining developments, but again, developers need to make sure that doesn't mean they have to include 30 meters between the battery and the solar, because that wouldn't really make sense. So so there's a few things in there to sort of keep aware of when you're co-locating batteries.
Thank you, Colin. Richard, I don't know if you have anything to add that you've seen particularly.
Yeah, I suppose battery storage is relatively nascent still, but as Colin suggested, the vast majority of NSIP solar projects going forward at the moment are promoting BESS co-located with solar. And various issues have come up at examination. It seems to be a rife opportunity for certain objectors to sling mud at solar projects, including jumping on news stories about exploding batteries at various places around the world. and the potential need for hazardous substances consents. So I think in the, as Colin again alluded to, over the next few months, there should be a much more certain framework about how best will be treated at examination and by planning authorities. But also linking back to what was said about community engagement. I think we, the solar community, can do more to educate local communities and everyone in the local community stakeholders on how batteries interface with solar, what their key environmental effects are, and that exploding batteries aren't the norm. So yeah, there's work to do on that, but I think we're going in the right direction.
Thank you. I think we probably have time for one more question. So I know that everybody sort of touched on the National Planning Policy Framework. So I think both yourself, Joanna, and Richard, you both mentioned about how increasing the threshold at which solar projects are determined as nationally significant. So it's been increased to 150 megawatts from 50 megawatts. Which, might I add, has been proposed with the intention of sort of speeding up deployment and I think to reflect the changes and the efficiency and the size of projects that we're seeing today. So Joanna, you don't believe that this is actually going to make much of a difference, but Richard, you on the other end sort of saying, no, this sort of takes it to the national level, so it makes it a lot easier. Yeah, I think we should expand on that.
Shall I jump in? So yeah. I think it's the easiest thing to do policy wise, right? It's a very easy thing to change the number, and what the government's responding to is that no one is doing a DCO in that level, so let's put it in the TCPA. And I can understand that from a local perspective, they probably feel that that's great, that's empowering a local planning authority. Community will probably feel like the decision is being done closer to them and not at the national level, so that feeling of something being done to them. But there's lots of things at play here in terms of grid, securities, cable routing. It is not just a case of the planning threshold that makes it not an attractive situation. I think there's the pricing of, do you go for a DCO cost, or when you add in doing 150 megawatt and the cable routing and your securities and the likely appeal that will happen, because it will go to appeal, then it doesn't necessarily warrant it being as cheap a solution. Perhaps it probably will relatively be cheaper than a DCO, but the DCO gives you much more certainty in your decision. What would be better is a quicker DCO route for smaller projects, which is harder from a policy point of view to write in, but yeah, that would have been, I think that's something that many people would probably prefer. Thank you, Joanna. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on.
Yeah, well, just to add that I don't necessarily think it will result in an increase in TCP applications at that level. But I think promoters should have the option. So even if the threshold does go up, then they should have the option via Section 35 to bring their scheme into the NSIP regime if it's apparent they need, there's local opposition, that they need compulsory acquisition powers, etc. So I don't think it will make a huge difference. Joanna also alluded to the sort of simplification of the NSIP regime, and hopefully the fast track will work, but it's slightly perverse in my mind that the fast track is for sort of simpler, more straightforward projects, but those projects are required to undertake the enhanced pre-application costs, so paying an additional £209,000 a year and doing all sorts of things pre-application when they're supposedly simple projects. So yeah, I'm yet to see that's going to work in practice. So I'm slightly sitting on the fence, you see.
Okay, well, we'll all see then, won't we? So I think we're coming up to time. So I think it's clear that whilst there are obviously still challenges in the planning process for solar projects that remain, there are definitely some effective strategies that are coming up and hopefully positive developments underway. So thank you for everybody who has joined us today. Thank you to all our speakers. We at the REA will continue to advocate for the changes needed, and we look forward to continuing this important conversation with yourselves, everyone else on this call. Hopefully Waterfront will share everyone's details. Please reach out to any of us if you would like to know more on any particular areas. And also, finally, a big thank you to Waterfront for organising and hosting us all today. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.